and welcome to Among the Jungle podcast. I'm botanist and host, Shii Kaina, and I'd love for you to join me as I interview the incredible plant people of Instagram to create an audio vault of inspiring botanical knowledge while harnessing a deeper connection with us in our natural world. If you're ready, it's time to inspire your wild. Aloha, jungle dwellers, and welcome to episode 12 of Among the Jungle podcast. You know I'm looking forward to today's episode because this is a topic that is profoundly supported by seasoned gardeners, and yet younger generations hardly ever mention it. Why is this topic so important? Well, I am glad you asked. We are about to find out. In today's episode, we will learn how the lunar cycle affects plants, understanding the importance of each phase, and practical tips on how to easily implement this system into your home or garden. I am so excited to welcome you, friends, to the jungle. Today we are talking about planting with the moon, also considered lunar gardening. As one of the oldest agricultural techniques of all time, lunar gardening schedules gardening practices according to the different phases of the moon. And there are definite reasons for this. The concepts for lunar gardening date as far back as we've been using plants for food and propagating them to harvest. What's crazy is that this concept of gardening is highly supported by the Farmer's Almanac, which is your go-to guide for figuring out when you should be planting your fruits and vegetables, whether it's indoors, outdoors, when to direct sow, when to transplant, everything for your zone. The Farmer's Almanac is a guide that has been using the agricultural past as a guidebook for what's coming in the future. And it is one of the most accurate ways to run a garden. So it's crazy that this is so substantially backed, and yet it's not talked about all that often. So why aren't we talking about planting with the moon more? Well, today we're going to figure out why it is so important, how it can really benefit you. In the show notes, I'll provide visual examples of experiments that have been run planting with and against the lunar cycle so you can see some comparisons, some visuals, any links, and everything I mention in today's episode will all be there, including access to the Farmer's Almanac, where you can figure out where and how you should be planting for your particular zone and area. What's exciting is there's a phase of the moon for all your gardening activities. So this is a philosophy of working with nature instead of against her. It may seem a little out there, but just trust me here, you're going to understand the simplicity of how it works here very soon. So let's start with how Luna affects plants. Well, we know one thing really important about our moon, and that's that she governs moisture. Am I right? We all know that the tide is pulled in and out with the moon. We know that the moon is so powerful in pulling our oceans that in places like here in Alaska, we have something called a bore tide, where our tide can literally range anywhere up to 12 feet differentiation between low tide and high tide. When the tide comes back in from low tide, so much water is being pushed into the inlet at once that it actually produces one long wave that goes entirely across the inlet. It is so incredible to see. So if the moon has that much power to pull the entire ocean, it's also moving the water inside of us, inside of the soil, and inside of plants. So since we know this is happening on a massive scale in the ocean, and in a more subtle way in our bodies and in the soil, this understanding is where we begin to lay a foundation of how this could positively benefit seeds. If the moon can control the water in the soil and in the seed, it can rise it up to soil surface, allow the water in the seed to swell, resulting in greater germination and better established plants. It's pretty crazy. It's also important to understand that the moon's light affects seeds. Certain seeds benefit more from the darker phase of the moon when they're being planted, and some seeds benefit more from the brightness of the full moon when planted. So we have differentiation in moisture level that can benefit the seeds. We have differentiation in lighting from the moon that can benefit the seeds. And then there's also something known as geotropism. Geotropism is how plants grow in response to gravity. So we know that roots grow downward in the direction of the gravitational pull, and stems grow in the opposite direction. This geotropism behavior can easily be demonstrated with a potted plant. If you were to lay it on its side, the stem will begin to grow upwards. Or you could even consider a tulip bulb. If you planted the bulb incorrectly with the pointed side down, that bulb will turn itself around and send its shoots upward. Even though it's in total darkness, it can sense the geotropism. So now that we know the moon can affect the moisture in the soil, its light can affect the seeds, and geotropism, its gravitational pull affects the seeds. Let's figure out when is the best time to do what in the garden, because that's what this really all comes down to. There are 4 main phases of the moon that we use agriculturally speaking: the new moon, the first quarter, the full moon, and the last quarter. The new moon we know is when we go outside and there is no moon in the sky. As soon as we go out and see the crescent from that new moon, this is the time to plant. From the new moon until the full moon is the perfect time to be planting your above ground vegetables. This is when the light of the moon is considered waxing or increasing in light. So during the new moon itself is not a good time for planting, but as soon as you see that first crescent, you can begin sowing seeds and transplanting into the garden. So in seeds during this phase, the lunar gravity pulls water up, causing the seeds to swell and burst. In your plants, there's a large surge of energy through the plant and the sap begins to rise through the stems. These factors, along with the increase in moonlight, create balanced root and leaf growth. This is a perfect time for growing your plants like lettuce, spinach, cabbage, celery, even things like tomatoes, peppers, pumpkins, broccoli, and beans, anything leafy and annual that will be growing above ground. The time between the new moon and the full moon is considered the fertile and wet time. So this is a great time to transplant and start all seeds that are growing above ground. Now, once we get to the full moon, this is when plants are at their absolute peak. This is the perfect time to harvest crops and herbs, especially medicinal herbs, because this will be the most potent time for them to be picked. After the full moon phase, from the full moon to the new moon is considered the waning period, and this is when light is decreasing. During this time, the earth is considered dry and is the best time to plant below ground crops. The gravitational pull at this part of the lunar cycle is extremely high, creating more moisture in the soil, but the moonlight is decreasing. So it's putting all that energy towards the roots. So this is a great time to plant your root crops: potatoes, beets, turnips, carrots, asparagus, and rhubarb. All those root-based crops, this is the time to be planting those. Also a great time to prune, but we are only doing this up until the last quarter moon. The last 7 days of the lunar cycle, there should be no planting. This is a time for tending to soils. This is a time to weed, to mulch, to compost, to rest, and the time to wait until we see that first crescent of the moon again, into which it's time to begin planting again if we have perhaps a new succession or something else that needs planted. What's interesting is this whole cycle actually goes a whole world further, where you get into agricultural astrology and you start getting into where the moon is placed in different zodiacs. I'm not going to fully go into this in this episode. I may do another episode on this, or I have a guest in mind that I think I would like to bring on specifically for this topic. And since ancient cultures have been working with this information for ages, it just makes sense to continue to pursue what works. They say the water and earth signs, Cancer, Scorpio, Pisces, Taurus, Virgo, and Capricorn, are said to bring moist and fertile conditions. Most air and fire signs, Gemini, Aquarius, Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius, are said to be barren. Some signs are even believed to benefit specific types of plants. For example, Taurus, which is the moon we're in now, is said to favor leafy greens, while corn does best under the influence of Scorpio. Who knew? The most exciting part of all of this is that we are currently sitting in the most fertile lunar cycle of the entire year. April 24th to May 7th is the most fertile time this year to plant all your above-ground plant seeds and transplants into the garden. May 7th is the full moon, and while we're just getting into full spring, this might be a good time if you do have herbs at home to harvest your herbs. May 8th through the 14th is the perfect time to plant all your root vegetables and prune your garden. May 15th through the 23rd is time for a sacred pause. This is when you can weed, till, mulch, compost, and work with the soil. I highly recommend you try to put one of these practices into place over the next several weeks. Like I said, the next week in general is a powerful week for planting your seeds, so be sure to get out there and get all your seeds planted before May 7th so you can really benefit from this lunar cycle and from the most fertile time of the entire year. It's exciting. If you want to learn more about lunar gardening, the best resource you can possibly tap into is the Farmer's Almanac. Not only do they give you the gardening tips and planting advice for your zone, everything comes with a lunar cycle suggestion right alongside of it. They really do swear by this method. You can also subscribe to the newsletter through our website, which will keep you posted for tips I'm going to be putting out for each lunar cycle to help keep you guys guided and reminded of the exciting gardening season ahead. Do you have a friend who would love to learn how to plant with the moon? Please share this episode with them so we can all benefit from this fertile time of year and from growing our gardens together. I'm so thankful you tuned in to learn about lunar gardening today, and I hope you found some useful tips that will help you get started planting with the moon in your very own garden. Isn't it amazing how connected we all are? Us, the water, the moon, a giant constellation, a single seed. It's quite magical, all that exists and all that is working together in a natural rhythm, a rhythm that we used to also operate on. As we step forth into our bright new future, let us remember this rhythm and just how much easier it is to work with nature instead of against her. This week, I challenge you to use the rest of this super fertile lunar cycle to work in the garden as outlined in this episode. Even if you only try one of the items, take a photo and tag us at Among the Jungle Podcast so I can share it with the rest of the community. Be sure to follow Aloha Shii and Among the Jungle Podcast on Instagram to stay tuned to our lives, our IGTVs, and all the fun things that we keep going on there. You can find the show notes for this episode at amongthejungle.com/012. There you'll find all the links, graphics, and anything mentioned in today's episode so you can easily navigate working with the lunar cycle yourself. Please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast, and share with your favorite plant friend. I hope this episode inspired your wild, and I hope you see a bountiful and fruitful harvest come the adjacent full moon this fall. I wish you happiness and joy in the garden, in your indoor jungle, and in everyday life. And until next week, jungle dwellers, love, light, and aloha. I am so grateful to the plants that bless this beautiful earth, and to you for choosing to nurture a wild place inside of your heart. I hope this episode inspired your wild, and I'd love to hear your feedback, suggestions for future guests, and other botanical notes at amongthejungle.com or amongthejungle on Instagram. It's been lovely exploring this exotic world with you today, and I look forward to where the journey takes us next week. Mahalo for tuning in, and stay wild.